Hello there, sword friends. It's time for me to do part 2 of the video review on this RyanSword $350 folded laminated sword that was sent to me some time ago for review. I did a part 1 video. If you haven't seen that already, I will link it in the description down below. It includes kind of my thoughts and ramblings on the build quality, general performance, general usage, general stuff, and just a lot of close-ups of the fit and finish of the sword and kind of my thoughts up and to the point of basic usage. And so I'll link that below along with measurements and specifics and that kind of malarkey. Take a look at it if you haven't seen that first video. I also included in that video some disclaimers at the beginning. I try to in every video. This isn't any exception. This was sent to me for free from RyanSword. It's about a $350 sword before shipping. I got it for free. I didn't pay any money for it. If you think that makes me biased, you know right away. 2, I'm not an expert in these things. I studied Japanese swordsmanship. I've done it for a long time, but I'm not a master. I'm not an expert. I'm not a teacher, more importantly. And so keep my musings and ramblings with that context in mind. The other bit of bias I think is important to know right now is that I really like the sword. Over the months of using it and having it, it was a fun tool to have. So that's a bit of a spoiler alert for the end section of do I think it's worth it or not. For the money, I thought this was a really good sword. It moved around really well. It was loud. It was a fun training tool. It cut really well. I thought it was a very handsome sword. It's got lots of fittings that are in a theme that I really like. So if you slap a bunch of swirly mitsudomes on it, it's hard for me not to like it. But the way it moved, the way it drew, the cost, I mean, overall I thought this was a very good sword, and that opinion is likely going to color the things that I say about it. So I guess just know that stuff as you hear me ramble in the rest of this video. Speaking of that, we'll jump right into it. So this video is mostly focused on the breaking of the sword. It's the destruction portion of it, and it's not fair to call what I do testing because there's no scientific methodology to smashing things into the sword, but hopefully it gives you some idea what a sword like this can take and if that is worth your money. And so I will say the first bit that I did was a little, well, somewhere between the last video that you saw in part 1 and somewhere between when I took it in the backyard and pushed it to failure. I did some tatami mat cutting with it in class, and it cuts really well. It's a little light. It's not necessarily geared toward being a performance tatami cutter, but in my hands or in somebody else's, it seemed to do the job pretty well. Out of the gate, it was pretty sharp, and it was really more my form that messed it up. It's worth knowing that I threw some bad cuts at this sword, not intentionally, just because I'm not particularly good at it. And it didn't bend. I didn't notice any issues. It kept an edge. I didn't notice any significant scratching or really any problems with the sword. The ito remained tight, and I can't say I used it a lot, but I did do iaido with this a reasonable amount. It was something fun to use. It made a really audible swishy sound as I was throwing it around, and that's what kind of drew me to it. So I like the way it drew. I like the way it felt. It's a little small for me personally, but still, it was a fun training tool. Anyway, the point I was trying to drive at is in terms of tatami cutting, it did the job, so I didn't bother cutting more tatami with it because tatami is expensive. I did, however, bring it out to the backyard, and I started on some aggressive targets. One, I cut water bottles with it because I don't think I did that in the first review, but I focused on cutting into the neck of the kind of thicker section of the water bottle just to see if any edge damage happened, and I guess I could say that none of it really did. There was a very small amount at one point in the cutting where I noticed, I don't even know if it's going to come up on camera, but a very small amount of edge damage from the water bottles. And I think it's important to say that because a lot of people expect that you can cut through a water bottle, that it should be easy, it shouldn't damage your sword, and I agree with you, but the thick spine of those water bottles can be pretty aggressive to swords, and I've had very expensive swords diminish in quality somewhat on some of those water bottle necks, specifically the really thick hard part. So the middle of the water bottle is pretty thin, but around where the cap is, it can be pretty thick. And if you do a bad cut or even a good one, it's a tough target for a really fine edge to cut through. I damaged my Motohara blade, which I believe those get plenty of accolades for being very good, well-made swords, but I cut into the head of a water bottle bad, and it diminished the edge slightly. On a Sheng sword not too long ago, on a different review, I cut into a water bottle, and I straight up chipped the edge on the sword. So I've come to find that the water bottle neck testing is actually a reasonable edge test, so to say. Now, you might expect it to just be able to cut through water bottles no matter how thick they are, but that's not realistic from my experience. It seems like that's a pretty tough target in some cases. In this particular case, though, the sword really didn't diminish in a very tangible way. There was some slight edge dulling that I could see visibly, but it felt really sharp. It still remained pretty sharp. The next thing that I did is started to test it on logs, and this is where some of the damage started to happen to the sword. So I wasn't terribly impressed with how straight the blade remained. Now, this is a differentially hardened blade. It's not supposed to kind of spring back. That's a through hardened blade that's going to have more of those characteristics, but I thought I took a bend a little easier than it should have here. It was easy enough to straighten back, just a kind of a swack on the side, got it back to straight, which is also a little bit concerning, I guess, that it's that easy to kind of bend out of shape. But differentially hardened blades, some of the best, most expensive ones, when you throw up a bad strike, even at a tatami mat, they're known to take a set. This didn't with tatami, but it did on logs. And this is abusive, so kind of damage is expected, but I was still a little sad to see that, you know, the sword bent. In any case, I didn't notice any kind of visible edge chipping or dulling, but I did notice that it lost some of that kind of hair popping sharpness to it. So it lost some of the bite on the edge, but not necessarily a substantial amount. I would still call it really sharp, very effective, very dangerous at this point, even after cutting into logs relatively aggressively. And so I cut into a lot of them. At a couple points, again, the sword bent, but it didn't really diminish all that much. At one point, I took the tip of the sword and just kind of drove it into the plywood stand that's at the base of my stand, and the tip deformed slightly. That was about the only kind of thrusting that I did with this sword, and the tip rolled over a little bit. It's a very hard tip. Well, hard tips, I guess, would have broken off, but the tip rolled. It didn't hold up particularly well to the plywood, but then again, it had a very fine edge, and generally speaking, you're not thrusting into plywood. So know that the tip did roll a little bit. So at this point, I would say I wasn't exactly impressed with the overall durability of the sword. It maintained an edge pretty well. It cut pretty well. It had a good geometry. It was fun to move around, but I would describe it as maybe a little more flexible than it should be. But that changed a little bit when I started moving into some of the more aggressive targets. So from there, I brought it to an aluminum shaving cream can where I struck down at kind of the thickest part of the can, and very little edge damage was sustained. So it took some, but I would call it relatively minor, all things considered. And again, I'm not cutting into the thin kind of sidewall of the can. I'm cutting straight down into the kind of meatier steel part of the can. So that's where I noticed relatively little edge damage, all things considered, and so I thought that was impressive. Further, when I took it to the croquet mallet of doom, so to speak, the new guest star on the channel here that I use for sword breaking, it kind of bit into that relatively well. Honestly, I was kind of surprised at how deep it was cutting into the mallet and how much metal it was taking off there, but it didn't do a whole lot of damage to the sword. It took a lot of strikes on that mallet, and gradually the edge would chip off. It would roll in some spots, which is again expected when you're striking into a softer metal target with a differentially hardened blade. Little chunks are usually going to break off, and then theoretically they could be polished out, they could be sanded, but if you can refine that edge, you can still have a functional sword. That's obviously not the goal here. I'm pushing it to failure, but basically I struck it along the edge several times, and while chunks would break off, it didn't exactly take any damage that couldn't theoretically be fixed by a polisher or by reprofiling the edge. Turning it on the spine and striking hard against the spine started to open up cracks. Another note here, the kashra has come off. And this is usually the recipe that I use to break swords. So I do lots of hard strikes against a metal target that's putting a lot of shock into the sword, and likely some cracks are forming that I'm not able to see. When I flip it around and strike it on the back, those cracks widen, and it's a recipe for failure on just about any sword that I've tested. So in this case, it's one of the first times where I've seen a pretty wide crack that looks like, okay, failure is imminent, and turned it around and had to take several more strikes, been able to flip it back around, strike it several more times, and then turn it around and hit it some more before it's broken, at least in a katana style blade. So I thought that was actually really, really impressive. I was really surprised at how much beating it took once a crack formed. Basically, once that happens, it's likely going to break. That's the expectation. It's just be wary of the helicopter of death that's imminent. Try not to be in its path, but expect failure very shortly. And you can see in the video that I'm striking several times after it's cracked, and it's still maintaining some sort of presence as a weapon. So I thought that was pretty cool. That I thought was impressive and somewhat redeeming in the maybe easily bent section. I was not particularly impressed at how Easily it took a set. I wouldn't call it easily. I was abusing it. That's not fair to say that it was easily. But it did take a set on some aggressive targets. I thought it would have been nicer if it stayed straight, or at least I would have found it impressive. I was impressed by how durable this was once it cracked. Hopefully you never get there. Hopefully your sword isn't cracked. And if it is, I wouldn't advocate that you keep using it. But I was impressed that it maintained itself in some sort of weapon-esque posture for as long as it did after it had multiple failure points on it. So that much was impressive. If you imagine a battlefield scenario, which obviously this wasn't on, but if you were in some sort of battlefield scenario and your weapon's cracked, like it still has several good strikes in it where it's functional as a weapon. Obviously, your faith is diminished in it because it's got lots of failure points on it, but at the same time, it still was able to strike into a metal pipe, which was pretty good, or a metal stake. Anyway, so that's where the sword failed, and at that point I kind of showed some of the grain structure in the sword. I showed where it broke, and this is where I want to get to the next part of it. So, hopefully you see what it took to break the sword. The next question I think that a lot of people have about the RyanSword in particular is it what is disclosed? So this is supposed to be a Hanwei, at least that's what's advertised, and I'm honestly not 100% sure which sword RyanSword sent. They said it was like one on their website, which I've provided a link to, and in that link it says Hanwei, if I'm saying that correctly, which, as I understand it, implies 3 different types of steels. So you have kind of an outer layer, which is on either side. Now, sanmai would just be 2 types of steels. You have the outer layer steel and then something harder in the middle that is on the cutting edge, and then obviously not hardened the same way along the spine, and so it results in something softer. But Hansenmai, as I understand it, is you have a hard steel on the edge and then a softer steel on the spine and something kind of in the middle on the sides. And I was kind of concerned is it a laminated blade at all? It's easy to see folded, but sometimes lamination lines and things like that can be faked. And RyanSword has had some criticism in the past for selling what were supposed to be laminated blades and weren't. So that's what I wanted to test afterwards. So I took the sword inside and I sanded the thing down so that I could see an even surface, because otherwise if I just leave the pitted, pocketed stuff like that on the sword, it's tough to make out the cross section and if it's laminated or not. Now, I can't say for sure based on what I'm seeing here if this is a Hansenmai blade indicating 3 types of steels, one on the outer edge, one on the spine, and one on the edge, but it could be, and I'm not entirely sure. It's not clear necessarily from the cross section when I broke it, and it's not entirely clear to me from the cross section as I've etched it. So first I took it and I put in like a mixture of lemon juice. I thought that would be enough. It wasn't. It was taking too long. I added some vinegar. That didn't work. So I dumped all that mixture out, added some hot vinegar, and let it sit for a couple days. Now I do have a clean enough etching to show that it is in fact a laminated blade. That much I believe is very clear from here. But is it Hansenmai or Sanmai? I do not know. What I do see is I see what appears to be a jacket layer on the outside, and I see a middle section, so it could be sanmai. And what I do see is the vinegar has hit the spine section and the center section differently than it has the edge section, but I don't know if that indicates a different kind of steel or just that the hardened section is etching at a different rate. So I don't know enough to say if it is or isn't. I am happy to say at least that it is in fact a laminated blade. It would be arguably stupid of RyanSword to tell me they were sending a laminated blade, knowing that I break them and etch them and check that kind of thing, and then not to send me a laminated blade. So I'm glad there. I don't know that that's going to assuage any critics, but I can say that as advertised, this was advertised as a laminated blade. It is in fact a laminated blade. Is it Hansenmai? I don't know. In fairness, none of the communication I got from RyanSword specifically called out Hansenmai. They told me that the blade was like the one in the link that I sent. So I'm kind of making some assumptions here. I don't want to bash the company in any kind of way that's undue. They never told me we're sending you a Hansenmai blade. Anyway, take from it what you will. It is at least a laminated blade. All right, so hopefully that clarifies how the sword broke and kind of my thoughts leading up to it. I do want to also point out some other condition things. One, the kashra came off and started to come undone. It's worth noting that I didn't have to go looking for it. The knot remained tied, but basically enough of the shock went into the handle, and the way I hold it, basically the kashra came undone. Whatever adhesive is used here didn't hold up to some of the shock. It's also worth noting that the adhesive that I'm feeling under here is somewhat pliable. It's not like a hard epoxy. It feels like a softer softer type of adhesive, whatever it is. It has a little bit of give, but it wasn't enough to kind of keep up with the shock and the impact that was put on here. The fittings have also loosened up, so the tsuba wiggles a little bit and stuff like that. All that is to kind of be expected when I'm doing some of this aggressive stuff. Kasha is coming loose and things coming undone while I'm doing this is pretty par for the course. It's nice when they don't, of course, but at the same time, a lot of handles in the kasha in particular start to give way when you're doing particularly aggressive things. There's no great fix to that either when it comes undone. It's not a great way to put it back on and just glue it unless you catch it immediately and reapply some sort of adhesive. A lot of times this would result in having to re-wrap the handle, which can often cost more than the sword itself sometimes. Anyway, it is also worth noting that I use this sword for Iaido and kind of general practicing and moving around, maybe more than I would most review samples, because I happen to like how easy and audible it was to move around. It was a very nice training tool, as I mentioned earlier. So the Ito, for what it's worth, actually held up really well to that usage. I didn't notice it loosening over time at all, and it wasn't until I was particularly aggressive with it that the kasha came off and the Ito started to come undone. All right, I suppose it's time for me to wrap it up and tell you, do I personally think the sword is worth it or not? Short answer is yes, I've alluded to it already. The only downsides I can really come up with in terms of durability have been that it took a bend a little easier than I would like. Not that it's unexpected. I was cutting into logs, and it's a differentially hardened blade that's not meant to be particularly springy, and it took a bend, and fancier blades than this have done that. I guess I would say it's an opportunity to impress me that it missed. I thought it took a bend a little easier than I would like it to, but I guess I can't be terribly surprised that it did. The tip also rolled over in the first punch into a plywood sheet, and that's not exactly great either. I would like it to be durable, though. Again, I'm punching a very fine tip into a plywood sheet. It's not a terrible surprise that it bent, but at the same time, it'd be nice if it didn't, if the edge was profiled in such a way that it could take an impact and a thrust in that type of way. Now, I do know that it straightened out pretty easy. A swack on the side of the blade, and it kind of sprung back to true pretty easy, and I didn't notice any twisting or anything terribly detrimental after the bending. It's a little concerning that it's that easy to bend, but at the same time, it went back to normal, back to usable, back to straight pretty quickly. And the bend in the tip would be pretty easy to reprofile if you have a file. The top 2 millimeters, you can kind of not necessarily straighten it out, but break it off and reprofile the tip, and even a klutz like me can do it without too much work. And it's not terribly noticeable. It's there. It's a bummer, but it's also relatively easy to fix. It's not as though the top inch broke off. It's kind of the top 2 millimeters rolled over. Beyond that, the kasha coming off and the other things like that are all kind of to be expected, and I can't say I found them particularly disappointing. Other than that, though, I think everything is good. The Ito was reasonably tight. The fitting set came in a theme that I found pleasing, and hopefully something is like that for you. The blade was folded and laminated, hopefully at least, I don't know if it's the right kind of lamination, but nothing granted was set in stone, but it is at least a laminated blade. And that's a lot of work with all these fancy fittings for $350 before shipping, and I think it makes a very compelling offering. This sword was put together pretty well. It was a very nice training tool. It cut really well while it was alive, at least into the things that it was supposed to. Came out of the box with an edge that didn't need to be retouched or reprofiled, and on top of that, it was a pretty and fun blade to move around. So I was pretty happy with this for $350. I thought it was a great sword. I would have liked to maybe play with one that was a little bit more my size, particularly, but as it is, if something like this fits you, I thought it was a lot of features for the asking price, and a lot of them put together in such a way that was pretty good. More than that, I would say it's pretty rare to impress me with durability, and it's not that this sword didn't break when I kind of predicted it to, but it did take more strikes, and I really expected a lot of those kind of big, large cracks that opened up in the blade to mean failure almost immediately on the impact on the spine, and the fact that it was put together in such a way that it held together for more strikes was impressive to me. I thought that was not that that's going to be particularly helpful to you, but it did suggest to me that it's a reasonably well put together sword, and hopefully the one you would get is similar in quality level to this one here. So in terms of this one for $350 before shipping, assuming that the shipping is another $50 or $100, yeah, I think that this is overall a compelling offering, and hopefully I've done a good enough job of explaining why that is. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully the video's been interesting. I'll call it here. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.